Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So, today's part in the series on the history of the Hanafis, or the history of the Hanafi Madhhab, if you will, I want to talk about Kitab al-Asl, which is written by Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani, the direct student of Abu Hanifa. He also studied under the eponymous Imam Malik. And so most of the secondary literature that we see in the academy, the Western Academy, the Oriental Studies type departments, Near Eastern Studies departments, and so on, they're very myopic in one serious way. Most of the Orientalist literature, and I think, Shacht is quite formative in this. Much of this secondary literature does not consult Shaybani's Kitab al-Asl, which is his magnum opus. It's the oldest extant legal text that exists, that we have. And as far as Islamic law goes, it's a massive book, as I, showed in the first video of this series. And it's, as I mentioned before, Joseph Shacht had access to Kitab al-Asl before 1950. And, this book was published even in, 1981, edited by Abu Wafa al-Afghani, who's a very, famous editor of books, especially Hanafi books. So it was published as Kitab al-Asl Ma'ruf bil-Mabsut from Dar al-Ma'ruf al-Uthmaniyya. So, it's been around a little while. Like I said, Shacht had access to it in the 40s. And now there's a new critical edition that came out in 2012 by Mehmet Bunoykanen. Sorry if I butchered that name. And so, Shacht, he relies quite heavily on Kitab al-Athar and the Muwatta by Shaybani, but not Kitab al-Asl. So it's kind of a interesting dynamic there. And, all the secondary literature, because of Shacht, has looked at Kitab al-Athar and the Muwatta from Shaybani, but not Kitab al-Asl. And I think Kitab al-Athar and Shaybani's transmission of the Muwatta are actually meant to be supplements to Kitab al-Asl. Oftentimes, Kitab al-Asl will make references to certain hadiths as if there's another book that you should be going and looking at for those hadiths. And I think that he might be talking about perhaps Kitab al-Asl. In Kitab al-Asl, he might be talking about the Muwatta that he transmitted, or Kitab al-Athar. And so Shaybani will mention reports, like hadith or akhbar in Kitab al-Asl without showing us the report or the narrators. But these reports can often be found under the same or similar chapter headings in Kitab al-Athar or Shaybani's Muwatta. It should be importantly noted that perhaps the first book of Islamic positive law, Furu', is Kitab al-Asl. This alone makes one wonder why it was not considered worthy of academic inquiry previously. The book has the feeling of a dialogue between Shaybani and Abu Hanifa, where the former postulates a question. I said, "What is your opinion on a guy who does this or that?" قلت أرأيت رجلا كذا وكذا. And then Shaybani receives the answer from Abu Hanifa somewhat like, he said, "It is not permissible for him, لا يجزيه." Dr. Bunoykanen argues in his preface that Shaybani had a significant impact on early Islamic law. Remember in the first video, I showed how the introductory volume for Kitab al-Asl is just Bunoykanen's study on the book. So it's one volume is an entire introduction and study of the book. And so one of Shaybani's students, Asad bin al-Furat, made a collection of positive law called al-Asadiyya that the author of the Mudawwana, the Maliki book, references. He also quotes the famous saying attributed to Shafi'i: the people are dependents, their dependence upon Abu Hanifa in regards to fiqh. Okay, they're iyal. Alright, so الناس عيال في الفقه على أبي حنيفة. He even mentions one of Shafi'i's students, al-Muzani, who relays that one of his Shafi'i teachers used to create positive law based upon the books of Muhammad bin al-Hasan. Bunoykanen also relates a report about Ahmed bin al-Hanbal. From where did you get these detailed issues? Al-Hanbal answered that they are from the books of Muhammad bin al-Hasan. According to Bunoykanen, one would be led to believe this was a very influential early legal text, most likely the first of its kind and the largest at that time in positive law. So basically, as far as I can discern from the historical record, Kitab al-Asl is the first fiqh text on furu' al-fiqh ever written. And like I said, in modern print, I mean, it's a massive, like 12-volume book. And it seems like every other legal text that was written after it on positive law, that book was consulted, and their books were modeled after it. And that's what we're talking about here, where you have Muzani and Ahmed ibn Hanbal both consulting this book, even though they themselves have their own epistemology, their own hermeneutic, and yet they're consulting this book as a model for how they should write their own books according to their own legal methodology. And there's a chapter in Kitab al-Asl titled "The Indentured Man Who Becomes Muslim Upon the Hands of a Man Who Indentures Him, and Subsequently Enters a Contract with Him." Within the chapter, Shaybani mentions cases where the Muslim man who contracted the indentured servant, when the Muslim man dies and the indentured servant had paid the Muslim man enough to be free, and who recently became Muslim, and this Muslim man has no relatives to inherit his wealth. Thus the question arises, does the recently converted freed servant inherit the wealth? Various answers are given for slightly different circumstances. For instance, if the servant did not convert to Islam and still a servant, and the Muslim owner who died had no inheritors, then the inheritance would go to the caliph's treasury, Bayt al-Mal. At the end of this short chapter, all three cases are said to be the opinions of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Shaybani, arriving upon these verdicts by analogical reasoning, qiyas, of Ali bin Abi Talib's saying, his qawl. وهذا كله قول أبي حنيفة وأبي يوسف ومحمد على قياس قول علي. So the saying is not specified, but under the chapter heading, the contract of the contractee, مكاتبة المكاتب, in Kitab al-Athar, we find the report. Muhammad al-Shaybani said, Abu Hanifa informed us, أخبرنا, from Hamad bin Abi Sulaiman, from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, from Ali bin Abi Talib, may God be pleased with him, regarding the contractee, mukatib, i.e. the indentured servant. He said he is freed by that which he has paid, and he is enslaved by that which he has not paid. This is likely the report Shaybani was referring to. Therefore, via analogy, the indentured servant, contractee, who has fully paid his contractor, owner, has the possibility to inherit from his contractor if there is no familial heir. This also shows how the Arabs had conceived of clientage during the 8th century. That is, a client, even when freed, was seen as part of the former owner's household. This legal epistemology shows how the Hanafi founding fathers did indeed actually use textual hadiths, and used analogical reasoning to make every legal verdict traceable back to the Sunnah of the Prophet via the Kufan tradition. thus repudiating the idea that Hanafis did not use hadiths or were unaware of them, or that somehow they were so based in local tradition that they did not have a universal legal epistemology. And it shows that they were not using an unsophisticated, crude legal epistemology as sometimes claimed by Orientalists. The next chapter heading in Kitab al-Asl is the manumission regarding the analogy of the saying of Zayd regarding the contracted indentured servant. Shaybani says, if a man dies and leaves behind taraka, a slave, and had already manumitted half of him, thus Abu Hanifa indeed said, he is in the position of an indentured servant. Then the indentured servant is in the position of a slave as long as 1 dirham, silver coin, remains upon him. Shaybani then says, Abu Hanifa used to say, the partially manumitted person, or 2/3 of him, or 5/6 of him, the inheritance is not regarded as his. He does not inherit or block, yahjibu, anyone from his inheritance. He is in the position of a slave, mamluk, as long as the work of a dirham is upon him. Under this assumption, Shaybani details other cases where the partially manumitted servant does not inherit, even from his free biological brother. Shaybani states, all of this is the saying of Abu Hanifa. He analogized it upon the saying of Zayd. وَهَذَا كُلُّهُ قَوْلِ أَبُو حَنِيفَةَ قَاسَهُ عَلَى قَوْلِ زَيْدٍ. However, both Shaybani and Abu Yusuf disagreed. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani said regarding a slave, if he was partially manumitted, therefore he is in the position of freedom in all of his affairs. He inherits like the free inherit, he blocks like the free block. The partially manumitted is not like the indentured servant in any of that. Here there are possibly two things happening. Firstly, Abu Hanifa takes the saying of Zayd bin Thabit, a companion. He, the indentured servant, is a slave as long as there remains anything of his contract unpaid, and analogizes from it. There is no report cited by Shaybani and Abu Yusuf, so perhaps they were using istihsan, but it is not entirely clear. Much of Shaybani's text is teeming with mentions of analogy, qiyas, in the chapters that do not deal explicitly with ritual acts, meaning the chapters on mu'amalat. So it's kind of interesting here. We look at how Abu Hanifa talked about the slave who is partially freed, and therefore he becomes like an indentured servant, mukatib. And then both Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani, they flip on that. They flippity-floppity, and they are basically disagreeing with Abu Hanifa, and it's not clear exactly what kind of legal reasoning they're using or what evidence they have in mind or how they're coming to their conclusion. But I think it's also important to note that the Abbasid revolution was really a revolution that had to do with many peoples, especially from Persia, converting to Islam. And where some say the Umayyad dynasty was very influenced by Byzantine Rome, the Abbasid revolution was the Sassanid backlash. In other words, the spirit of Persia lived on through the Sassanid revolution, and the spirit of many new Muslim converts and their sentiments lived on through this. In other words, the clients, the mawla, these people who they did not have a high social status in society like the Arabs who belong to a specific tribe. And so these clients who they might be part of an Arab tribe just through clientage were in a sense mainly indentured servants, or they didn't have the same rights and status and power in society. So therefore the Abbasid revolution came in a way to rectify these social issues. And it's well known that Harun al-Rashid helped commission Kitab al-Asl and put Shaybani in this position where he patronized him, with caliphal money, in order to come up with this legal text here. And here, the Muhammad Shaybani and Abu Yusuf are being very pro mawla, or pro client, in this regard. They're caring for the low people in the society who basically made the Abbasid revolution happen. And so there's a chapter called the chapter of the Hermaphrodite, or Mukhannath. And it begins with a hadith. Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani, from Abu Yusuf, from al-Kalbi, from Abu Salih, from Ibn Abbas, from the Messenger of God, that he was asked about a baby of a boy from the people. He had what is for the woman and what is for the man. How does he inherit? He said, the messenger said, from where he urinates. In the subsequent chapter, the chapter on inheritance of the hermaphrodite, in the saying of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani, regarding the qiyas of the saying of Amr al-Sha'bi, there is a report from a Sha'bi who was asked about the baby who is neither male nor female, and did not have what is for the male. A body of thick urine comes from his navel. He was asked about his inheritance. Amr said, he gets half of the fortune, of a male, and half of the fortune of a female. Muhammad al-Shaybani said, we have that, هذا عندنا, and the androgynous hermaphrodite, al-Khuntha al-Mushkil, receives it similarly, amarahu siwa. Here, a report regarding a specific individual is applied via analogy to any hermaphrodite that does not take the characteristics of male or female more strongly. In other words, an androgynous hermaphrodite. And that person's right to inheritance. So he used qiyas to kind of look at different circumstances where someone might not have the same biology, and was able to say, well, how should this person inherit according to the gender norms of the time? In the next chapter, we see a hadith at the very opening that goes directly back to the second caliph and companion Umar. So occasionally a full sanad is traced back to a companion in Kitab al-Asl, and as we've seen, to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself. In various chapters, not all, as we have saw above, the Kitab al-Asl refers back to the basis, the asl, of each chapter's legal matters. So it's giving you some sort of legal epistemology, even if it's not as fully hashed and written out as maybe you might see in Kitab al-Risala from Imam al-Shafi'i. But he's giving you little crumbs here and there of explicit legal theory. And it may be one report from which all the verdicts of the chapter were systematically reasoned from, using ra'i. The term that was likely coined in the 10th or 11th century, usul fiqh, legal theory. We now know that if you look in Rad Siyar al-Awza'i, if I can talk tonight, from Abu Yusuf, he uses the word usul fiqh in that text. So we know that that word actually does predate Shafi'i, or at least is contemporary with Shafi'i. But, Abu Yusuf was senior to Shafi'i and lived before him. So this phrase does exist back then, we know for a fact, because it's in this text, Rad Siyar al-Awza'i. And Azmi talks about that, al-Azmi, in his famous refutation of Shacht. So, this is kind of something it should be, I guess, a little bit more well understood or well known. Also, Benjamin Yokish, in his book on Islamic imperial law, he mentions, that if you look at the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim, and you can, Google and download this book, a PDF of it, in the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim, you can see that he lists under the works of Muhammad Shaybani a book on usul fiqh, or at least it's titled with usul fiqh. So we do know that this term did exist before the 10th or 11th century. And we do know that it existed probably before Shafi'i, or at least the same time as Shafi'i. Although Kitab al-Risala is kind of seen as the first book in the usul fiqh genre, at least that we know of, or that's extant. Even though Shafi'i never really actually used that word usul fiqh, he never used that compound, idafa structure term. However, it does appear that in Kitab al-Asl, there are at the very least precursors to what would later be called usul fiqh. In other words, perhaps part of the aim of Kitab al-Asl is to show the epistemological underpinnings of the Hanafi circle, or the Ahl-Ra'i, as hard as they may be to extrapolate from the text sometimes. That is not to say, however, that Shaybani had any articulated linguistic hermeneutic, but there is certainly, albeit moderately, an epistemological framework articulated. The emergence of an articulated hermeneutical epistemology was gradual, and to pinpoint it to any particular figure or text is a little arbitrary by the academic. Like, when do you say, okay, this is where usul fiqh started, and this is where it didn't exist? I mean, it was gradual. Surely, in the minds of those jurists, they had a well thought out, well reasoned epistemology. But I'm just talking about philological analysis of texts here as a historian. And Kitab al-Asl, even now, if you talk to any Hanafi mufti, they're going to tell you, even if you look at like Sharh Uqud Rasm al-Mufti from Ibn Abidin, that is the Zahir Rawaya, okay, of the madhhab. Every mufti should go back to Kitab al-Asl. So, I mean, it still has a very serious spot in the Hanafi Madhhab today, and it's not a book to be ignored by any means. And over the centuries, Muslim jurists have constantly looked at this book to get epistemological ideas or epistemological framework and these types of things to understand what is the Hanafi epistemology, what is the Hanafi usul al-fiqh or legal reasoning or whatever terms you want to use there. And in Kitab al-Asl, only the first volume and 1/3 of the second volume, and I'm not talking about the introduction by Muhammad bin Waikilan, but if you just look at the first volume of the text of Kitab al-Asl there, and the third of the second volume, so 1 volume and 1/3 contain the ibadat. So the ibadat are covered over, it seems like pretty quickly in comparison to the rest of the book. However, it's in quite some extreme detail, actually, if you read it in the Arabic there. For instance, I think there was like at least 30 pages just on Mas'h al-Khufayn. So just wiping over the Khufayn, Mas'h al-Khufayn, you have 32 pages, I think it was. And so the rest of Kitab al-Asl, which is 10 volumes, contains the interpersonal ritual laws, or mu'amalat. So the vast majority of the book deals with mu'amalat, which kind of makes sense, being that it was Harun al-Rashid, it was a caliphal authority who wanted this book to be the law of the land for the Abbasid Caliphate. And as we know, what did the Abbasids do? They routinely and regularly appointed Hanafi judges. So they were trying to systematize and organize a more or less uniform legal system that the whole empire could use. And the Umayyads also, the law was very much more from their, you might say, caliphal verdicts. Of course, it was, based in Quran and Sunnah according to their understanding of it. But the ulama class of jurists, or fuqaha, you might say, had gained some more authority during the time of the Abbasids, so they were kind of more the ones in charge of that, or they were delegated to do that task by the Abbasids. And we'll see over time the Abbasid caliphs lose authority when it comes to the law. Even, you might say, the legal authority of the Hanafis, in a sense, kind of erodes with the Shafi'i and Hanbali and Ahl al-Hadith challenge to their authority, especially with the mihna, as we have mentioned a little bit before. And so the chapter where the ibadat switch over to the mu'amalat and kitab al-Asl is extremely intriguing, but simultaneously perplexing. The chapter title is Kitab al-Istihsan. Istihsan literally means seeking the good. I do think that Wa al-Halaq's model of istihsan was quite right in that it was a mode of reasoning that may be called common sense. And it was primarily used to avoid societal or individual hardship that a law or ritual may cause, and it was employed perhaps to achieve equity and fairness. The chapter begins with a very long discussion elaborating on who is a mahram, non-marriageable relative, and who is not, what actions you may do in front of a mahram, and how to behave around the non-mahram, and how to handle sexuality, all commonsensical rules for the greater good of society. And it's very culturally contingent as well, so probably that's why it's in this chapter, Istihsan. And perhaps, this was like a nascent precursor to the later Hanafi legal theory discussions on societal mores or urf, culture. Most of the passage has to do with lowering the gaze, i.e. not looking at a non-mahram in a desirous manner. One passage states, the man to the man, he should not look at another man like a woman looks at a man. He should not look at the man between his navel and his knee. So you don't look at other men with desire either. And this is in the oldest extant, Islamic legal text. There is no harm in looking at his navel. It is disliked to look at him between the navel and the knee. Likewise, for the woman to the woman. Therefore, Kitab al-Asl alludes to homosexual urges and suggests that one should not indulge in looking. Like with the heterosexual desires, again, a commonsensical approach to prevent illicit sexual actions in society. Then a hadith about the waist wrap, izar, is brought to demonstrate that the navel is not from the nakedness, awra. There is also a discussion on a woman who becomes wounded, and how is it permissible to treat her even if you must look at her nakedness. It also has conduct related to male-female conduct when the woman is menstruating. The first subchapter is the looking and the touching of the bondwoman when he wants to buy her. So clearly slavery was a big part of the Abbasid Caliphate. There Shaybani says if the man wants to purchase a bondwoman, Jariya, then there is no harm that he looks at her, her chest, her legs, her feet, and her breasts, even if he lusts, ashtaha, for that. There is also chapters regarding proper conduct if a woman dies around non-mahram men and vice versa. There is a subchapter on the testimony regarding a matter of religion. There are matters of trusting the testimony of other Muslims that are discussed, and whether or not a certain person is a reliable transmitter of testimonies on religious matters, such as purity in containers used for ablution, the location of water, whether or not food is pure to eat, or etc. Like, when can you trust somebody to ask those questions? One passage, if I can talk tonight. One passage says the ablution container, wudu, is in the position of what all has been described to you if there is difference regarding what has been described. For if there was he who told him that it is pure was two trustworthy men, except there were two slaves, and there was he who alleged that it was forbidden was only one free man, then there is no harm in using it. If there was two trustworthy enslaved men who alleged that it was forbidden, and one free trustworthy man who alleged it was pure, then he should not use it. This section also contains many hadiths with a full sanad, back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One where the Prophet says regarding taxing Magians, Majus, treat them like you treat the people of the book, al-Kitab. The reason it is mentioned is because it is argued that this testimony was taken by Umar, the companion, from one testimony, that of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, another which has a chain from Waqi' to Sufyan al-Thawri, all the way up to the Prophet, where the testimony of one person of a moon sighting was accepted to start fasting Ramadan. Do you testify that there is only one God and I am the messenger of God? He said, yes. So the Prophet ordered the people to fast. So that is what indicates to you that the testimony of one in the religion is accepted. There is also a subchapter on testimonies regarding suckling, selling a bondwoman that is known to be owned by somebody else when a man enters one's house bearing a weapon. What to do if you find out that you and your wife were both suckled by the same person in childhood, that you're milk siblings, or murder, etc. As stated before, these appear to be all commonsensical rules for the social well-being, what was later to be called the maslaha. So Kitab al-Asl is replete with many hadiths whose chain of narration end at a successor, skipping to the Prophet, which is known in hadith nomenclature as mursal. In the chapter on eclipse, there is one such hadith. He said, we were informed from Muhammad, who said, we were informed from Abu Hanifa, from Hamad bin Abi Sulaiman, from Ibrahim an-Nakha'i, from the messenger, may God bless him and grant him peace, that he prayed 2 units during the eclipse. Then there was supplication until the sun revealed itself. This demonstrates that there were certain successor transmitters that were seen as trustworthy, thiqah, and whose testimony was taken despite the companion not being named. In other words, it was taken for granted that the people went through a companion. Perhaps this was substantiated by the praxis of Kufans or other reports not mentioned here. Another mursal hadith in the same chapter is connected back to Hasan al-Basri, then skips to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A third statement of the Prophet is mentioned with no chain, simply stating, it has reached us, balaghana, from the Prophet regarding the eclipse prayer. It is ambiguous if balaghana has any technical meaning. Therefore, the multiplicity of the reports likely strengthened them enough to base legal verdicts off of. In other words, perhaps these were mashhur. So it is interesting to note that even figures like Hasan al-Basri, for those who are researchers of Hasan al-Basri, are mentioned in Kitab al-Asl. Kitab al-Asl is this massive book of historical gems, if you will. And so there's a chapter, the prayer of seeking rain, where there are more hadiths that simply have balaghana. I will translate the entire chapter below. This is my own translation. I said, so is there in seeking rain istisqa, a prayer, salah? Abu Hanifa said, there is no prayer in seeking rain, but rather there is supplication in it. I said, have you not seen that people gather for it in prayer and the Imam recites out loud? He said, I have not seen that, but rather it has reached us, balaghana, from the messenger that he would go out supplicating, and it has reached us from Umar bin al-Khattab that he would go up on the pulpit, minbar, supplicating, seeking rain. It has not reached us regarding that prayer, salah, is included except in one anomalous shadh hadith, which is not taken from. I said, is it recommended that the Imam change or one of the people change his cloak, i.e. his custom? Regarding that, he said no. That is the saying of Abu Hanifa. Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani says, I am of the opinion that the Imam prays seeking for rain just like the prayer of Eid. He begins with prayer before the sermon and does not say God is the greatest within it, like he would do so in the 2 Eids. That is because it has reached us from the Messenger of God that there is prayer for seeking rain. It has reached us from Ibn Abbas that he commanded that the Imam should change his custom regarding that. he should change his cloak by placing the left side on the right and the right upon the left. We only follow this sunnah and the known reports al-athar al-ma'rufa. It is not mandatory for those who are behind the Imam. I said, so do you prefer that the non-Muslims, Ahl Dhimma, go out with the Muslims regarding that? He said, I do not prefer that. The Muslims should not be close with God by means of a non-Muslim. It has reached us from Umar bin al-Khattab that he forbade a non-Muslim should be made present with the Muslims because of indignation that will come down upon them. So how will they be made present to the supplication of the Muslims, I said? What's your opinion regarding the Imam when he preaches regarding seeking rain? Is it obligatory upon the people to listen and hearken? He said, yes, I prefer that they listen and hearken, but it is not mandatory like the two Eids and Jum'ah. I said, should the pulpit be brought out for the two Eids and seeking rain? He said, no. I said, what's your opinion regarding the call to prayer and the establishment, iqama, of praying regarding that? He said, no. I said, should the women go out for that? He said, no. Already, Benoikelin has located all the hadiths mentioned in these chapters. They all appear in the canonical hadith collections known as the Sound Six, or As-Sitta As-Sahiha, as well as other collections. This is evidence that these hadiths are older and much older than previously thought. In other words, these hadiths were likely known to the Ahl al-Hadith, and this marks an epistemological shift, where Shaybani aims to particularize, or at the very least compile more hadiths, much more than Abu Hanifa. So he was relying on, maybe a shadh hadith, or he had access to more ahadith than Abu Hanifa did. So it marks a departure from the Kufan tradition as Abu Hanifa knew it. Not praying the eclipse prayer. Shaybani's acceptance of the eclipse prayer is based on a report from Ibn Abbas during the Abbasid dynasty. Perhaps suggests that this was a ritual gaining practitioners during that time period. It also shows that when more certain evidence was not available, Shaybani was willing to take what appeared to be during the time of the text was written, Mursal reports, as evidence. So when I'm trying to think of early Hanafi history and try to look at this idea, that the Kufans kind of had a local practice that they then transformed into a universal, epistemology. You look at Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, and you look at Hamad, and Hamad bin Abi Sulaiman and Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, they were following a local Kufan tradition, which they got from the Sahaba, and they kind of, for me, mark the local Kufan practice. And Abu Hanifa is kind of like this intermediary, where he's starting to transition to a more universal legal epistemology or hermeneutic. And then Abu Yusuf and Muhammad Shaybani kind of put like the last nail in the coffin and universalize it to be, this epistemology that can be applied anywhere independent of the Kufan tradition, yet still has vestiges of that Kufan tradition within it. When you look at Studolsky's dissertation, I think it's clear that Abu Hanifa had a pretty good idea of what a legal epistemology should look like, and he put it into practice. And then Muhammad al-Shaybani and Abu Yusuf, they just built upon that, and I think likely Muhammad Shaybani was the first to put it down into more clear writing. And then, Shafi'i, being a student of Shaybani, further put it down into writing, and you might say further systematized it, or laid it all out on paper form, if you will. So I feel like it's a very gradual kind of transition that's going on. And we also have to remember the milieu, that there was a lot of Mu'tazili thought, a lot of translations happening from Greek to Arabic, and there was a lot of logic and syllogism and all these different things just floating around. And so a lot of discussions about how do we interpret the Quran and Hadith in terms of theology are also, I think, being applied to fiqh too. They're thinking about the same things for practice, just in a slightly different way. And with that, I'd like to conclude this, section here on Muhammad al-Shaybani's Kitab al-Asl. And I would like to implore you to please subscribe to my channel. That way you can, keep seeing my weekly history videos on Islamic history. And you can also click the little bell icon too. That little bell icon allows you to get notifications so that whenever I upload a video, you're more likely to know about it if you don't want to miss one of my videos. Also, give my video a like. That, helps me grow the channel. And if I can grow the channel, I'm going to have more time to make, videos for you guys. I really enjoy doing this. This is my passion. That's why I went to graduate school for it. I've been interested in Islamic history for the past 10 years. And, I just ask for your support. I really like to know what you guys are thinking. If you can leave comments below, I'll try my very best to answer them. You can send messages to my Facebook page or also to the Twitter account, and I'll try my best to get back to you guys. And I really want to hear what videos you guys want to see from me, whether it's on Islamic political history, the Crusades, or what have you. Just let me know, and I'll try my best to get those made. Ma'as salama.